When I was 22, I thought I knew what success looked like. It was wearing my father's old wristwatch, driving to work before sunrise, and standing beside him in the dusty office of Hartman Logistics, a freight company that was once the pride of Chicago. My father, Richard Hartman, had built it with calloused hands and sharp instincts. Back then, we owned only a handful of delivery trucks, 2 worn-down warehouses near the river, and a reputation that had started to fade along with the paint on our logo. He used to say, "Lizzie, business is like a long road. You only stop when the tires fall off." At 22, I believed him. I believed everything he said. He was my hero, the man who could turn a conversation into a deal and a handshake into a promise. So when he told me one morning, "It's your turn to steer," and tossed me the office keys, I thought it was the proudest day of my life. I didn't realize then that it was also the day I inherited his debts, his stubbornness, and the heavy silence of a company on the edge of collapse. The first few years were brutal. Every night, I stayed in the office, my desk lamp the only light burning in the building. I learned to read contracts like novels and memorize fuel prices like scripture. I ate cheap sandwiches from the corner deli and slept on the couch in the break room, wrapped in my father's old jacket. While my friends were out in New York and Los Angeles chasing dreams in fashion or finance, I was counting invoices and calling clients at midnight, begging them not to switch to bigger competitors. Somewhere in that chaos, I stopped being Richard Hartman's daughter and started being Elizabeth Hartman, the woman who wouldn't let a dying company become her father's tombstone. I still remember the first big break. It came in my 4th year when I convinced Monroe Steel, a manufacturing firm from Detroit, to sign an exclusive delivery contract. I promised them faster turnarounds and lower costs, though at the time, I wasn't sure how I'd pull it off. When I landed that deal, I drove to the lakefront, parked my car, and cried, not out of joy, but out of relief. That $3.2 million contract meant we could finally pay off our fuel suppliers and buy 3 new trucks. It was a small victory, but it tasted like freedom. My father watched from the sidelines. He'd retired officially, but he still came by the office every week. He'd walk around, inspecting things, asking questions, and leaving before lunch. Sometimes he would pat me on the shoulder and say, "You're doing fine, kid." But his eyes told another story. I wanted his pride. I wanted him to look at me and see not just a replacement, but a builder. By the 8th year, we weren't just surviving, we were growing. I'd hired new managers, built partnerships in New York, and invested in technology that made our logistics network smarter and faster. We expanded routes across the East Coast and even opened a small branch in London, our first step into Europe. I remember walking through Heathrow Airport, jet-lagged but thrilled, thinking, my father's company is going global. He called me that night. His voice was flat. "London, huh?" he said. "That's ambitious. Don't forget, growth can kill faster than failure." I laughed it off, but deep down, his words left a bruise. Still, I pressed on. By year 10, Hartman Logistics was a name people respected again. Our contract stretched from Chicago to Los Angeles, and our revenue topped $840 million. We had partnerships with airlines, major retailers, and even luxury brands that needed precision delivery. I had built something powerful, something real. I could walk into any boardroom in Manhattan and speak with the confidence of someone who had clawed her way up from the bottom. People often ask me what drove me back then. Was it money, ambition, pride? The truth is, it was none of those. It was fear. Fear of losing what my father had built. Fear of proving his doubts right. Fear of being just another woman in business who tried and failed. Every dollar we earned felt like another brick in a fortress I was building, not against the world, but against his silence. In those years, I learned the hard truth about success. It isolates you. The higher you climb, the fewer people you can trust. I lost friends who thought I had become too serious, too consumed. My relationship with Michael, my boyfriend then, later my fiancé, was strained by my endless hours and constant travel. There were weeks when I didn't see daylight except through the office windows. Yet every time fatigue hit me, I'd look at our growing numbers, the fleet of trucks with our silver and blue logo, and remind myself, You're building something that will last. My father never said thank you. Not once. But one afternoon, I caught him standing in front of the main office wall, staring at the framed world map dotted with all our new branch locations: Chicago, New York, Dallas, London, and Paris. He didn't see me watching, but I saw him smile, just slightly before he walked away. That moment, small as it was, carried me through every storm that followed. Yet even as the company thrived, something inside me began to shift. I started noticing that every success, every contract, every award, somehow still bore his name. The company was Hartman Logistics, after all, his legacy, his initials on every document. And no matter how high I climbed, I was still living in his shadow. I told myself it didn't matter. That as long as the business grew, as long as our employees had jobs and our clients were happy, the rest didn't count. But when you've built an empire, when you've turned a struggling $1.4 million company into an $840 million powerhouse, and your own father still treats you like a child, you start to question what legacy really means. I began to dream differently. I wanted Hartman Logistics to be more than a family business. I wanted it to be a symbol, a story of resilience, reinvention, and independence. I wanted to prove to him and to myself that I could lead not because I was his daughter, but because I was me. Looking back now, I see that those were the golden years, even if I didn't know it then. The long nights, the silent battles, the taste of coffee and exhaustion, they were the foundation of everything that came after. I had built a kingdom from dust. I had done what few thought possible. And yet, I had no idea that the man who had given me the keys 12 years earlier was quietly planning to take it all back. The night of the Christmas party began like every other celebration we'd hosted since Hartman Logistics became a national name. The ballroom at the Chicago Grand Hotel glowed with light, gold ribbons, white roses, and a 12-foot Christmas tree covered in crystal ornaments that sparkled like ice. The air was warm with laughter and jazz music from the live band, and the smell of champagne and pine filled the room. I wore a red satin gown that brushed the floor, and as I looked around at the hundreds of faces, employees, investors, and their families, I felt a rush of pride. It had been our best year yet. When I stepped up to the stage, applause echoed through the hall. 12 years ago, I began. We were a small Chicago company fighting to stay alive. Now we're standing among the largest logistics networks in the country, with offices in London, Paris, and New York. This success belongs to every single one of you. The crowd cheered, and I felt that familiar spark of belonging. These weren't just employees. They were the family I had built through sweat and persistence. My father stood near the bar, his gray hair sharp under the chandeliers, his glass of whiskey untouched. He was wearing his old navy suit, the one he used to wear when visiting clients. When our eyes met, I smiled, but he didn't smile back. I thought it was just his usual seriousness. He never liked crowds, and parties weren't his thing. But there was something in his face that night, a kind of stillness that didn't fit the occasion. After I finished my speech, the band started up again. People clinked glasses, couples danced, and someone shouted for an encore toast. I was about to join my fiancé Michael near the dessert table when I heard my father's voice over the microphone. "Everyone," he said, his tone calm but commanding, "I'd like to say a few words." The music stopped mid-note. Conversations froze. My mother, Catherine, looked surprised. He hadn't mentioned any plan to speak. Still, no one dared interrupt him. He walked slowly onto the stage, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back like a general before a battle. He began with polite words about the company, how proud he was of its growth, how much the team had accomplished. People nodded, smiled, raised their glasses. But then his tone changed. "And yet," he said, "not all growth comes without consequence." I frowned, confused. He turned to face me, his eyes sharp and cold. "Elizabeth," he said, loud enough for the microphone to carry every syllable through the hall, "as of tonight, you are no longer welcome in my house or on my property." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. A few people laughed awkwardly, thinking it was a joke. I forced a small smile, my heart pounding. "Dad, what are you talking about?" I said lightly. But his expression didn't move. Not a twitch, not a flicker of warmth. He took a sip of his whiskey and continued, "You have taken my company and turned it into something I no longer recognize. You've turned business into theater and loyalty into power. I don't want any part of it." My throat went dry. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, employees, friends, my fiancé, even the waitstaff. My mother gasped and stood halfway up from her chair. "Richard," she whispered sharply, "stop this." He ignored her. "You've forgotten where you came from, Elizabeth. Maybe you should learn what it feels like to build something from nothing again." I wanted to speak, to defend myself, but words wouldn't come. The humiliation burned through me like fire. This wasn't a family argument, it was a public execution. After what felt like hours, I turned, set down my glass, and walked off the stage. My heels clicked sharply against the marble, the only sound in the silent room. As I reached the exit, I heard him call out, "You'll thank me one day." I didn't look back. That night, I drove to the Lake Forest mansion, the house where I'd grown up, the house I'd bought back from debt when the company started thriving. I walked through the quiet halls, my footsteps echoing off marble floors I had paid to restore. Every photograph on the wall, family vacations, company events, birthdays, felt like a reminder of everything I was about to lose. In my old bedroom, I opened the closet and pulled down a suitcase. I didn't cry. Not yet. I packed a few clothes, my laptop, and the watch my father had given me when I took over the company. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the space that had once meant safety. Then I turned off the lights and left. It was snowing when I reached downtown Chicago. The streets were quiet, the city glittering with holiday lights that blurred through the windshield. I found a small apartment on West Ontario Street, rented month to month, furnished just enough to survive. The rent was high $4, $200 a month, but it didn't matter. I could afford it. What I couldn't afford was the silence that filled the place once I was alone. For weeks, I kept working. I threw myself into the company, pretending nothing had changed. But something had, something deep. My father didn't just evict me from his house. He'd drawn a line between us that couldn't be erased. At board meetings, his absence loomed like a ghost. Some of the older employees whispered, wondering if the rumors were true. I smiled through it, acted confident, and kept the business running. Michael tried to comfort me, but even he didn't understand the depth of it. "He'll come around," he said one night as we sat in my new apartment, the city lights glowing beyond the window. "He's proud, that's all. He doesn't know how to show it." But I knew better. My father wasn't proud. He was furious. Furious that his daughter had taken his legacy and made it her own. Furious that his name, his empire, now stood in my shadow. One night, about 3 weeks after the party, I drove by the old mansion. It was dark except for one light in his study. Through the window, I saw him sitting at his desk, staring at something, maybe an old photograph, maybe nothing at all. For a brief second, I wanted to knock on the door, to tell him I still loved him, that I still wanted to make him proud. But then I remembered his words, "You're no longer welcome in my house." I started the car and drove away. By the end of that month, I had accepted what I couldn't change. The father who had once taught me to fight was now the man I had to fight against. And deep inside, a quiet, dangerous thought began to take root, one that would soon change everything. If he thought he could take away what I built, he didn't know me at all. It was a gray January morning when everything finally collided, the past, the power, and the man who had once been my whole world. The air outside the Hartman Logistics headquarters felt colder than usual, slicing through my coat as I stepped out of the car. The building loomed before me, glass and steel rising over downtown Chicago, a reflection of everything I had built. For 12 years, this company had been my life. Every beam, every decision, every late night was mine. And yet, even after all that, it still bore his name. I had been away from the office for almost a month, working from home, pretending that the Christmas debacle had simply been a family issue that didn't belong in the professional world. My assistant, Rachel, had handled meetings, reports, and investor updates while I stayed in the background. But that morning, I couldn't stay away. There was a meeting scheduled with new investors from New York, people who wanted to expand our European operations and take the company public within 2 years. It was supposed to be a milestone moment. Instead, it became something else entirely. As I crossed the parking lot, snow crunched under my heels. And then I saw him. My father was standing just outside the front entrance, wearing a long gray coat and holding a cup of coffee like he owned the place. His posture was relaxed, almost lazy, but the smirk on his face carried the same sharpness I'd grown up fearing and respecting in equal measure. "Well," he said as I approached, "look who it is. I thought you'd be cleaning floors by now." His words hit like a slap, but I didn't flinch. I just stopped a few feet away and met his eyes. "Good morning, Dad," I said evenly. "Still making house calls, I see." He chuckled. "Someone has to keep an eye on things while you play CEO." I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Funny," I said softly. "That's exactly what I came here to do." I walked past him, ignoring the sting of his laughter echoing behind me. The security guard at the entrance, new, young, unaware of our history, greeted me with a polite nod. I smiled, even though my chest was tight. Inside, the warmth of the lobby did nothing to thaw the tension that had built over the past month. I rode the elevator to the top floor, watching my reflection in the mirrored wall. I looked composed, professional, hair neat, coat pressed, makeup subtle. But under that calm surface, I was shaking with resolve. Today wasn't just another meeting. It was the day I would take back what I had earned. When I stepped into the boardroom, the executives and lawyers were already seated. The air smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Michael, now acting CFO, smiled nervously at me from across the table. "Morning, Elizabeth," he said quietly. "Morning," I replied, setting my briefcase down. The investors from New York, 2 men in tailored suits and a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone, rose to shake my hand. They had no idea that my personal war was about to become part of their morning agenda. We began discussing projections, European expansion, and valuation models. The room buzzed with numbers, but my mind was somewhere else. I kept thinking of the document inside my briefcase, a thick folder bound in blue leather, signed, sealed, and notarized. I had been working on it quietly for weeks, moving through legal channels, buying out shares, consolidating ownership. Every time my father sold a portion of his stake over the years, I'd bought them back through a holding company he didn't know I controlled. Piece by piece, I had reclaimed the empire he thought was his. Halfway through the meeting, the boardroom door opened, and my father walked in. No one stopped him. He was, after all, still the company's founder and a member of the board. But he wasn't supposed to be there. Not that day. He said, glancing around the room. "Hope I'm not interrupting." The investors looked at each other in confusion. I rose from my chair. "You are, actually," I said, keeping my tone level. "This is a private session." He ignored me and sat down in one of the empty chairs at the table. "Good," he said. "Then I can hear how my daughter plans to spend the last of my company's money." The words hung in the air like poison. One of the investors cleared his throat, unsure whether to stay silent or leave. I forced a smile, though I could feel the heat crawling up my neck. "Richard," I said calmly, "you're welcome to listen, but as of this morning, it's not your company anymore." He frowned. "Excuse me?" I reached into my briefcase, pulled out the blue folder, and slid it across the table toward him. The papers inside bore my name, Elizabeth and Hartman, as the majority shareholder of Hartman Logistics Incorporated. The signatures of the board, the legal confirmations, the financial disclosures, all of it was final. "I've been consolidating ownership over the past 2 years," I said evenly. "This morning, the last transfer cleared. As of 9:30 a.m., I own 71% of Hartman Logistics." He flipped through the pages, his hands trembling slightly. The color drained from his face. "You," he began, then stopped, looking up at me with disbelief. "You can't do this." "I already did." He stood, slamming his palms against the table. "You ungrateful little—" "Careful," I interrupted, my voice sharp but steady. There are witnesses." The room fell dead silent. Even the investors were frozen, eyes darting between us like they were watching a live courtroom drama. I stepped closer to him, my heels clicking against the polished floor. "You told me I wasn't welcome in your house," I said softly. "But this company, this was my home. I built it when you had already given up. I saved it when you couldn't." He opened his mouth, but no words came. "So, if you're here to tell me how to run my company," I continued, "don't bother." I paused, meeting his eyes one last time. "Because, Dad," I let the word hang there, heavy and final. "You're fired." The silence that followed was deafening. His face turned pale, the lines around his mouth tightening as though he'd swallowed a stone. For a moment, he looked so small, so human, that I almost felt pity. Almost. Then he turned, without another word, and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, and for the first time in 12 years, I felt the weight of a shadow lift. The meeting resumed, though none of us spoke of what had just happened. When it ended, I stood alone by the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. Snow was falling again, soft and slow, blanketing the city like a promise of peace. I thought of all the years I had fought for his approval, the nights I had stayed awake chasing a dream that was never really mine to begin with. And I realized something I should have known long ago. I didn't need his permission to lead. I never had. That day, I didn't just fire my father. I freed myself. After that day in the boardroom, I didn't see my father for nearly 6 months. Chicago's skyline faded behind me like a closed chapter as I packed up my apartment and moved east. I needed distance, not just from him, but from everything that reminded me of who I used to be. I sold the Lake Forest mansion and bought a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, New York, a tall, narrow house with brick walls and creaky wooden floors that whispered history. From my terrace, I could see the Manhattan skyline glittering across the East River, alive with the pulse of ambition and light. Every night, as I sat there with a glass of wine in hand, the city hummed below me. Taxis honking, music spilling from restaurants, voices blending into the rhythm of something new. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing anyone's approval. I was simply breathing. The first few months in New York were strange. I had money, more than I'd ever imagined, but I didn't feel rich. Wealth doesn't fill silence, and it doesn't erase the echo of betrayal. My father's words still replayed in my mind like a broken record. "You're no longer welcome." Some nights, I'd wake up sweating, half expecting to see him standing in my doorway, ready to take it all back again. But then I'd remember, this was my home now, my life, my empire. Work, as always, became my refuge. Hartman Logistics had weathered the storm and was thriving under my leadership. The investors from New York loved my vision, expanding our logistics network deeper into Europe. Within a year, we opened our first major branch in London, followed by another in Berlin. I was traveling constantly, moving between time zones, meetings, and countries like a woman reborn. London became our beating heart overseas. The office was on the 20th floor of a sleek glass tower in Canary Wharf, overlooking the Thames. The first time I stood there, I thought about how far I'd come from that small warehouse in Chicago with leaky ceilings and a broken coffee machine. Now, I was shaking hands with ministers, partnering with billion-dollar corporations, and setting shipping routes that connected entire continents. Still, success felt different now. It wasn't about proving something anymore. It was about peace. I learned to delegate, to trust, to take weekends off without guilt. I started running again, exploring the parks of every city I visited. I took art classes in Soho and spent quiet Sundays reading in my Brooklyn living room. I even learned to cook, badly at first, but with time, I found joy in the simplicity of making something just for myself. One morning in London, my assistant told me my father had called the office. My stomach tightened instantly. He hadn't spoken to me since the day I fired him. She said he'd left a short message. "Tell her I'm fine. Tell her I hope she's doing what she loves." That was it. No apology, no explanation, just a strange, distant gesture. But somehow that was enough. A few weeks later, I received a letter at my Brooklyn address. It was handwritten, neat but shaky. My father's handwriting. Elizabeth, I don't expect forgiveness. I know I hurt you, and maybe I did it because I didn't know how else to let go. You became everything I once dreamed of being, and that scared me. I was afraid the world would take you away from me. In a way, it did. But I'm proud of you, even if I never said it out loud. You built something beautiful. Don't let my shadow follow you anymore. Dad, I read that letter a dozen times. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there on the terrace, watching the city lights blur into a soft gold haze. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or loss. I just felt free. That summer, I returned to Chicago, not for business, but to visit my mother. The mansion was no longer ours, but my father still lived in the small lakefront house he'd moved into after everything fell apart. We didn't speak much when I saw him. He looked older, thinner, quieter. We sat on the porch, watching the waves roll in, the silence between us thick, but not bitter. Before I left, he looked at me and said softly, "You did good, Lizzie." That was all I needed. When I got back to New York, I threw myself into preparing for our annual Hartman Logistics Christmas Gala, the first one I would host on my own. It was held in a rooftop ballroom overlooking the Manhattan skyline, decorated with soft gold lights and winter roses. The air buzzed with laughter, music, and the quiet confidence of people who knew they were part of something extraordinary. As the evening wore on, someone handed me a microphone. The room hushed. I looked around at my team, the people who had believed in me, who had stood by me through everything. My voice trembled at first, but then it grew steady. 12 years ago, I was just a girl trying to save her father's dream. I worked, I stumbled, I learned. But what I didn't realize then was that I wasn't saving anyone else's dream. I was building my own. Tonight, I want to thank you all for being part of that journey. Applause filled the room. Glasses clinked, people cheered, and for the first time in my life, I felt entirely at peace with who I was. No ghosts, no regrets, just gratitude. After the party, I stepped out onto the terrace. The winter air bit at my skin, but I didn't mind. Manhattan glittered before me like a sea of stars, endless and alive. I thought of my father again, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Maybe he had needed to lose everything to let me become who I was meant to be. I pulled out my phone and opened the company's stock report. Our valuation had crossed the billion-dollar mark that week. $1 billion. I smiled, not because of the number, but because it felt symbolic, like closing a circle. I had taken his legacy and turned it into something new, something that belonged to me. Later that night, as snow began to fall, I walked home through the quiet streets of Brooklyn. The sound of my heels against the pavement echoed softly. Somewhere inside me, a younger version of myself, the girl who once slept in the office, who cried by the lake after landing her first deal, smiled. She'd made it. When I reached my brownstone, I turned back to look at the city one last time before going inside. The lights shimmered through the snowfall, and I whispered to myself, "You did it, Elizabeth." And for the first time, I didn't feel like Richard Hartman's daughter. I felt like Elizabeth Hartman, the woman who built an empire, lost a father, found herself, and learned that sometimes the only approval you ever need is your own.